Well, I think let's resume. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. I would like to welcome friends watching this live webcast. I know that there are people watching us in Rio, in São Paulo, in Brasilia, in Mineiros, Goiás, believe it or not. I think in Piracicaba.
Goiás is enough for me.
Goiás, he's from there, so and also in Golden, Colorado, at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory of the Department of Energy. Before I introduce the speakers at this panel, this international panel, let me tell you and tell the people following us online that all the PowerPoints are online. So when they refer to a PowerPoint here, unfortunately we don't have a second camera to focus on the PowerPoints, but you can just go to the site and you will see the PowerPoints. One information we posted is a very interesting study that some of you may have seen, that refers to a topic that was discussed in the first panel. Professor Bruce Babcock from Iowa State University recently concluded a study on the costs and benefits to taxpayers, consumers, and producers from ethanol policies in the United States. And I think it would be useful if you're interested to take a look. Now, we have one more observation that I have to make as the director of the Brazil Institute. Secretary Chu and Minister Zimmermann of Energy in Brazil, they met recently, actually last week, here in Washington. The Memorandum of Understanding on Biofuels between Brazil and the United States is alive. I don't know if it's well, but it is alive. And I think the efforts between the technical people, the scholars, the researchers continue. And also an important information, I hope that Joe touches a little bit on that, on what we would call in Brazil the commoditization of ethanol. Is the fact, since in the last few months Brazil has signed agreements with Kenya, with Angola, with other countries, with a view of producing sugar-based ethanol for those markets. I think efforts continue in the Caribbean and Central America also. Now, I would like to introduce the members of this panel, starting with Carl Wolf. Carl is from the research analyst from BCS Incorporated. He's also a consultant to the Department of Energy of the United States. I will not read the whole biography. You have it here. And so I trust that you will read this. Also with us, Joe Velasco from UNICA, the Association of Producers of Sugarcane and Ethanol in Brazil, a dear friend that has been here, as Robin and Ford have been here before. And Alexandros Peterson, a senior fellow from the Atlantic Council. Carl Wolf will talk about the China perspective, especially the cooperation between China and the United States. There is also a memorandum of understanding between China and the United States. I think it was December 2007. One of the focuses is biomass, developing that. Joe obviously will talk about the Brazilian perspective, and Alexandros Peterson will give us the European perspective on what's going on there in the development and interest in biofuels. So we should start with Carl. And again, I think Carl has a PowerPoint. If you're interested, those not here, you can go online and download his PowerPoint. Thank you, Carl.
Okay, so I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the Department of Energy's Biomass Program in general, and then I'm going to go into the cooperation that the United States has with China on biofuels development. So we'll get started right here. Okay, so I think it goes without saying that the development of biofuels is a high-level priority within the administration. And there are four main thrusts that the Biomass Program basically, pushes forward when doing biofuels research and development. These include science and discovery, connecting basic and applied bioscience, conducting breakthrough R&D, including advances in enzymes and catalysts, engineering of new microorganisms, novel sustainability indicators. In addition, clean, secure energy, developing and demonstrating cellulosic and advanced biofuels to meet the renewable fuel standard. Economic prosperity, creating 50 to 75 jobs per new biorefinery, and creating major new energy crop markets and reinvigorating rural economies. And then also the climate change aspect or environmental aspect, reducing GHG emissions with advanced biofuels relative to gasoline. All right, so next slide, we are going to just give a quick overview of what the Biomass Program within DOE, what their objectives and goals are. Basically, the two main goals are to make cellulosic and advanced biofuels cost competitive with gasoline, and also to create a lot of ethanol, facilitate a lot of cellulosic and advanced biofuels development. We're looking to make 21 billion gallons of advanced biofuels by 2022. It's a very, very tough goal, but the Biomass Program is working to facilitate that. How do they do that? Well, they're looking at the whole supply chain of biofuels development, from the feedstocks, harvesting logistics, to biochemical and thermochemical conversion into the integrated biorefinery, and then developing an infrastructure-compatible fuel that will be able to be deployed into the market. Along this whole life cycle, sustainability analysis is performed to make sure that this whole system, this whole process, is a sustainable process. All right. So regarding China-U.S. cooperation, I'm going to take a step back real quickly and just emphasize how important the United States and Chinese governments are taking cooperation on clean energy. I don't need to read this for you, but I mean it's just the cooperation. It makes sense. I mean, when you think that China and the U.S. are the two biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, and the fact that the collective genius of the two nations can really help tackle some of the technical, economic, environmental, energy security aspects that are going on right now, and not to mention it makes sense from a policy and a diplomatic perspective as well. Okay, so this is kind of the implementation strategy that we've had, or the timeline of the biofuels cooperation that has been going on between the United States and China. So in December of 2007, a memorandum of understanding was signed between the United States Department of Energy and the United States Department of Agriculture and Chinese National Development and Reform Commission. We agreed to collaborate on scientific, technical, and policy aspects of biofuels development, production, and use. To dig a little deeper into that cooperation, the technical aspects include feedstocks, sustainability, conversion technologies, bio-based products, rural development strategies, and we are beginning to discuss cooperation on algal biofuels. So then, under the guidance of the National Energy Administration, we actually took a trip to China in May of 2009 and we had all our lab partners there. USDA had their representatives there, and we established technical working groups and really hashed out real technical work plans, real R&D that has been performed, in the past year since. Also, in December of this past year, the International Seminar for Bioenergy and Biofuels was hosted by NDRC and NEA, supported by Honeywell, also supported by the Department of Energy. Actually, Mark Ginsberg, who is on the board of directors for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, he participated and gave a talk there. This past May, we had the Sino U.S. Advanced Biofuels Forum in Beijing, hosted by NEA, DOE, and USDA participated, as well as industry participation. And coming up this September, we have a second technical working group mission to China to review the collaboration and advance it. So that's kind of where we are right now with the biofuels cooperation with China. Okay, so just to summarize, there's basically two tiers to the cooperation that the United States and China have in regards to biofuels. The one is the applied research and R&D that the labs are doing with the Chinese partners. So the technical collaboration in regards to biofuels, and we're working with CNUC, COFCO, Tsinghua University, PetroChina, all the big players in China on this collaboration. This collaboration helps facilitate the industry cooperation that we're trying to develop, and we're trying to grow markets in China for U.S. industry. So basically, what I want to stress here is that we're getting tangible results from these cooperations. We're leveraging core research that's being done in the U.S. to tackle technical issues in the U.S. with Chinese cooperation. And one final thought I just want to mention. The harmonization of biofuels policies and standards is going to be vitally important in order to develop global markets for biofuels. So for the U.S. and Chinese industry, we need to keep working on that aspect for sure. Anyway, with that, I thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion later. Thanks.
Joel, floor is yours.
You want this as well?
I guess so, yeah.
Use this.
And I can get, there am I. Good morning still. Glad to be here and opportunity to talk. I enjoyed the discussion. Previously I wanted to jump in, but I figured since I get the microphone for a little bit, I'll hold my comments to now. Let me just begin by saying biofuels issues, as is really any energy issue, which then in this case involves agriculture, is very complex. Mitzi, I can't see her from here, but she was absolutely right on this. And so let me try to simplify it, or what I call in my version of view of things as a layman, kind of dumb it down a bit. That here's sort of where we come from in our industry. First, in the short and medium term, it doesn't matter how much you believe that electric cars or electrification of transportation is the future. It may well be. But put aside whatever your view on this, we will need liquid transportation fuels in the world for a long time. Okay? Just imagine if the United States, all of a sudden, we woke up tomorrow and we all had plug-in electric cars in our garages, and that the entire electricity grid was powered from wind and solar energy, right? So sort of imagine that nirvana that would happen. What would happen to the price of oil the very next day? It would tumble in the world markets, and rest assured the Chinese, probably the Brazilians, would drive SUVs running on petroleum because price of oil would be probably $1 a barrel or less if you take U.S. out of it. So this is a very complicated transition we're involved in, and the role of liquid renewable fuels is going to be critical. That's where biofuels fit in, because they are, in essence, this important bridge to, let's call this perfect future we see out there. One of my issues that I would have loved to comment in the previous discussion was that don't equate biofuels with ethanol or even corn ethanol. Biofuels and actually bioenergy is a much more complicated, broader discussion. If you want to simplify it and get it down to Twitter-sized feeds, follow us on Cane Ethanol on Twitter, or go to our website and or YouTube. We are having a pretty fun time discussing these issues online, hopefully in a simpler way. But turning to my presentation here, then let me talk briefly about Brazil's experience, and I think try to shed some light to this discussion. First, who are we, right? UNICA is a trade association I represent. We're the leading sugarcane industry association in Brazil. We represent about 120 of the nearly 400 producers of sugarcane or sugarcane ethanol or sugar in Brazil. We're responsible for roughly about 60% of all the ethanol and sugar production in Brazil. Brazil, when it comes to sugar, is the world's leading producer of it. In fact, in the world market, we're somewhere between a quarter to 40% of the world's sugar production and consumption and trade in Brazil, in the world. We produced last year about 7 billion gallons of ethanol. By way of comparison, that's about half of what the U.S. will produce this year. And we have this wonderful little other product on the shelf called electricity that we make from renewable source bagasse. It's surplus from our own mills. So we've been making sugars for 500 years in Brazil. That's when the Portuguese first brought sugarcane to Brazil. We've been making alcohols actually for as long. We used to drink it. Now we put it in the cars. We still drink it, but we put most of it in the cars. Don't try to do this at home. I always say in the U.S. ethanol is denatured. It will kill you. In Brazil, it just makes you sick. We make electricity from bagasse. When we take sugarcane into a mill, we've got all this, 2/3 of the plant is straw, is biomass. We burn it in efficient boilers today, and those efficient boilers allow us to meet all the energy needs for the mill. So the mill doesn't have to bring in any natural gas or electricity from the grid. In fact, it sells the surplus to the grid. That helps a great deal in the terms of the climate profile, but it actually makes the business far more profitable and therefore reduces costs to consumers. And then at the cutting edge of research, we're already making plastics as well as hydrocarbons. Plastics, I think, is probably the most fascinating story in Brazil right now, is because if you take, for example, Coca-Cola's, if it has something called the plant bottle, 1/3 of that plastic bottle is the ethyl glycol in it is made from sugarcane ethanol. In fact, Coke's going to roll this out, I think, on a global basis. Brazilian company Braskem is now making a plastic from ethanol that they have shown that it is all the carbons in that plastic are actually carbon from the atmosphere. So I call it carbon sequestration, one bottle at a time. I think it's pretty cool line. And then we're also taking the cane juice and making hydrocarbons like gasoline and diesel, since we've managed to now displace half of Brazil's gasoline consumption with ethanol. So what does that mean for Brazil? It means that over the last 30 years, we've now can say that we're the #1 source of renewable energy. That's a huge feat, given that Brazil, 80% of its electricity comes from hydroelectric, which is another renewable source. And now we're the second largest source of energy in Brazil after good old oil. What that has meant in terms of climate mitigation, we have offset avoided over 600 million tons of CO2 over that period, including, by the way, the land use effects of that, for those who want to debate that point later. And we're pretty proud of that, and we're going to continue on that path. For For those who haven't had the wonderful pleasure of visiting Brazil or my old home state of Goiás, we grow most of the sugarcane in Brazil, as was pointed out, in the state of São Paulo. São Paulo is where the population center of Brazil is, so think Iowa meets California. That's where sugarcane is in Brazil. It is not in the Amazon, as you can see from this nice map. If you have any doubts about it, again, go to our website, sweeteralternative.com, and you can go have Google Earth meet sugarcane, and you can zoom in and see the exact mill location and where that mill is probably getting its sugarcane. And at our urging, so that's where sugarcane is grown, and then there's this issue of where it could expand to, right? And there was this question about, well, how much could it go? Well, here's what we did. We went to the government of Brazil in the heat of this debate over the last few years and said, help us by doing the following. Tell us where we can't grow sugarcane. We know where we are growing. It's not in the areas that everybody's concerned about, but show us where we can't. And so this mapping exercise, and again, online you can get much more zoomed in information on this, but the government went through a zoning exercise that basically said, and by regulation has implemented this, that no sugarcane in sensitive areas. That's where the yellow areas there on the map means no rainforest, no wetlands in Brazil, and a number of other areas, and absolutely no sugarcane in native vegetations. So you can't chop down the Atlantic forest to grow cane, nor can't you just simply take areas that have never really been touched for agriculture and then convert it. The reality is that leaves about, I think, about 60 million hectares of Brazil still available for agriculture. 65 million hectares. And that's about 7.5% of Brazil's territory could actually be suitable, allowed for sugarcane. As you all may know, we only use about 1.5 of that territory for cane today. And so we think we've got not only a good story to tell now, but we also know where we can grow. And that's important. If you want to really look at the numbers, here are the numbers. Basically, the PowerPoints are online, but roughly only 1.5% of Brazil's arable land is going to displace half of the country's gasoline consumption. You see, in Brazil, gasoline is the alternative fuel now. We consume more gasoline on a volume basis than ethanol. And the real issue in terms of Brazil's land use and most of the world is really pasture. Over half of Brazil's arable land is occupied by pasture. An average, the cattle in Brazil on average has about 1 head per hectare. That's 1 head for roughly 2.5 acres. I don't know about you, but my house is a lot less than an acre. And I live comfortably with 4 people. And a cow in Brazil has a whole 2.5 acres. Talk about fair. But over the last 30 years, in fact, almost back to when I was born, we've made great strides in yields. And this is a yield curve in terms of looking at the price per liter of anhydrous ethanol, which is the ethanol that most of us would have here in the U.S., to show that even when you adjust for inflation, and by the way, that takes a lot of exercise in Brazil, ethanol prices in Brazil today are about 30% less than what they were in 1980. Why? Because of yields. And this is the thing that everybody understands is not just true for sugarcane, but for all of agriculture. So if you don't understand where in the yield curve you are, you're really hard to project where you're going to go. And if you look at that in terms of Brazil, what it means is that starting in the late 70s, we have increased land use in Brazil. That's the green. The orange or salmon color is what we would have increased in land had yields not improved over that period of time. So that's land that we could say has been saved or has been was not needed. But look at in blue and in the red dotted line, the sugar and ethanol production. Both have skyrocketed. And what you see is that there has been roughly, if you go run the numbers, there's been a 3% average compound rate increase in yields over on the ethanol side during that period. That's pretty tremendous when you look at it that way. Doesn't mean that it will continue forever, but it means that Brazil has quite a ways to go still, because we've barely gotten into hybrid varieties of cane, for example, much less getting into the biotech side. when we discuss sustainability, a lot of focus is on greenhouse gas reduction, and so people will say, well, sugarcane is way better than corn, or corn's coming a long way. Here are the numbers of greenhouse gas reduction based on the industry estimates, or in that case, for example, we estimate roughly about 90% reduction in greenhouse gases compared to gasoline. And then you have, for example, EPA says we have a reduction of about 61% compared to gasoline. In California, somewhere around 40%. These are completely different methodologies at times, but just to give you a sense of where the trend is. But that's only half the story. The story is that on average, biofuels have reduced greenhouse gases and can reduce more. And I think there's a lot of discussion. And then the other thing, and I know some of my friends in the environmental community would point this out, carbon is only one aspect of sustainability. And I think this is one of the things that's lost in a lot of discussion of biofuels. Just a little more, say, propaganda, but why it is so important to understand the role of a biofuel in the case of sugarcane ethanol in Brazil and the country's energy matrix. In Brazil, as I pointed out, we're about 80% hydro for electricity. So this is what, if you're in the electrical business, says this is the hydrology issue in Brazil. The bars in blue are basically the amount of power that is produced from the water reservoirs in Brazil. But as you see, in the months of May through October, things really dip down. Why? Because that's the dry season in Brazil. And that means that that's the highest chance that Brazil could have an energy shortage because of low water reservoirs. So you get a couple years of really bad droughts, the reservoirs don't fill up, and Brazil's short electricity. Why does sugarcane play a role here? Because of that surplus electricity we sell to the grid, we can actually basically keep the reservoirs storing up water while we're putting surplus electricity into the grid. So it's very complementary in that phase. And this is an important story for countries in Africa, for example, because they're going to have, in many ways, similar hydrology issues. And so, again, biofuels playing a role along with traditional sources of energy. And here I just want to start moving a little bit away from Brazil and the discussion we were having earlier is when you look at a global basis, this should not be a Brazil-only story. This should be a global story about how agriculture can play a role in helping us mitigate both our climate challenge, our climate problems, as well as provide energy for a growing, developing world. There's about 100 countries in the world today that grow sugarcane. Only one of them is really doing biofuel out of it in any significant scale. But there are other countries. For example, Mozambique in the eastern coast of Africa. We have got one of our members has a large project there that has taken an existing sugar mill that's taking cane to make sugar to add on to it by expanding the sugar cane production to make also ethanol. Why is that important? Because Mozambique imports all of its oil. It imports, I believe, about 600 million liters of oil, of gasoline a year. So a mill like this one can help offset its imports of fossil fuels, but more importantly, provide rural development for that country. And so as we look here in the United States, we see that the policy really may require some changes, as the policy in many other countries in the world. What are sort of the principles as we see it for a viable biofuels policy globally, not just in Brazil, not just in the U.S. or any other country for that matter? First, we have to focus on feedstocks, agriculture that has good performance. Clearly, cane has been an ideal, cost-effective feedstock in Brazil, and it's always going to be in the tropics, okay? Cane is great where there is some rain, there's lots of sun, and abundant land. So geography, climate, and even politics may well end up dictating the feedstock choice, but it should really be performance, not policy. In other words, just because sugarcane is great in Brazil doesn't mean that you're going to want to force it into the U.S. as a feedstock here. It will do well in southern U.S. But same way that corn is a great feedstock in Iowa doesn't mean that the rest of the world should just presume that corn is going to be the ideal feedstock. Other countries are going to have different feedstocks. Performance is key. The second point is really technology neutrality. This may sound strange from the world's second largest producer of ethanol, but ethanol is not the solution to our liquid biofuels problem. That other biofuels and other forms of energy, of bioenergy, are going to be important. We're making electricity, plastics, and soon hydrocarbons. Third point is that sustainability really matters. If you're a businessman, you will probably figure that out sooner or later. But as farmers in Brazil, we have learned this both the good way and the hard way at times. We're committed to replacing fossil fuels with something better. That is sort of what really drives us. Lower carbon fuels, as I pointed out, carbon reduction is just the start. We think we've got a great story to tell there, but we've got a lot more to do. The challenge is to not just to grow crops, but also markets in a sustainable way. Ramping up demands overnight doesn't necessarily yield you the most sustainable future. The same way that just trashing biofuels just because it's not your biofuel doesn't necessarily get us there either. And water usage, land usage, labor concerns should always be driving that debate as well. And that's why we're so committed on this issue. I can show you a slide later, but we call it the Star Wars slide because we're involved at every roundtable discussion that there is about biofuel sustainability. And mind you, if we got a gallon of ethanol sold for every roundtable discussion we went to, we'd be doing just fine. The third one is that open competition matters. What drives me and a lot of people crazy is if we've got fossil fuels that are freely traded around the world, that if it's just fine for us to bring, Hugo Chavez's oil from Venezuela into the United States duty-free, why is it that we're tacking on tariffs here in the United States and in Europe and even in places like Mexico or China for that matter? That if we want to move away from fossil fuels, maybe we should also move our trade policy in that direction. And that is sort of why we're so committed to making this point here in the United States that sugarcane ethanol is a clean, affordable, renewable fuel that reduces our dependency on fossil fuels and actually can save some money at the pump. That as our trade policy is just out of sync with our climate and rural development objectives. And so if you go to our lovely website, I would say, sweeteralternative.com, you'll learn a lot more about this. Hopefully, I have tried to make it a little bit less complex, but if not, I guarantee you maybe our Twitter feed will do the same. Thank you.
Thank you as well.
Good presentation.
Now we'll hear from Alessandro's, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Pella, for having me, and thanks to, I don't know if Kent is still around, but thanks for having me as well. I think it's been excellent so far. I can't see that far. I'm so vain I don't wear glasses. If you've read my bio, you've probably seen that I'm not a biofuels expert, but I did for several years work on the European energy sector and what could potentially be, an EU-wide strategy for energy security and energy development. And I was working in Brussels in 2006 when the EU Commission drew up its EU biofuels strategy and was privy to a lot of those discussions. Now, I was asked to present the European or the EU view, but as is usually the case in Europe, there are several views, in fact, sometimes very contentious views, and often the EU Commission finds itself being just the 28th view after 27 member state views, if not myriad other views from industry and NGOs and so on. But biofuels have, over the past year especially, if you've been following it, and will continue to be, I think, for the foreseeable future, a matter of intense debate within the context of the EU's energy security and environmental ambitions. Within the context of its 2020 emission goals, as well as in the more sort of what I would say hard-headed context of diversification of energy sources for, at times, rather vulnerable EU energy consumers. So there have been a lot of key developments recently, and I'm going to talk about some of those headlines, not just the EU-Brazil-Mozambique plan for biofuels development, but I'm going to talk about the headlines a little bit later because I think they're very good in that they illustrate the conundrum that has become the EU debate on biofuels. And it is a debate that has parallels, with discussions here in the United States, in Southeast Asia, and Latin America. but for a number of reasons is more controversial in the EU context. And I would say that the main reason for that controversy, which has pitted EU officials, member state officials, industry, and NGOs, and in fact the number of NGOs that you wouldn't expect to be involved in the debate, the reason for the controversy is that is because the EU-wide commitments on CO2 emissions and environmental protection are taken very seriously, not just by EU institutions, that have drawn them up, and the countries that have had a part in doing so, and so-called concerned citizens, such as those of you sitting around here today, but also a much larger constituency by the general public. So the future of biofuel use in Europe is caught in the middle, if you will, in the sense that there's a real commitment to weaning transport and industry off of traditional hydrocarbons, but there's also a greater awareness in Europe of food scarcity issues, of the so-called global food scare was covered much more in Europe, for example, than it was here in the United States. Not to mention biofuel production practices that may in fact this is the argument of many in European debate, contribute more to CO2 emissions or not make much of a dent in some parts of the globe where, for example, palm oil is produced in Indonesia or something of that nature. So my first point would be that the debate over biofuels in Europe is generally more informed, but it's also more histrionic. And also, the old cliche about, partial information being the worst kind, being worse than ignorance, is a point to be made as well in the European context. But part of the reason for these histrionics, and I think that's an accurate term, is the perennial EU problem of setting very ambitious and very detailed goals with often not as much consultation as is needed beforehand with key stakeholders, and then expecting compliance without serious debate having been had first. For example, the EU biofuel strategy that was drawn up in 2006 and has since been amended a few times calls for no fewer than 7 main goals, all laudable, I would argue, but some are frankly approach the sort of world peace category of laudability. So, they are, I'll list them: stimulate demand for biofuels, ensuring environmental benefits, developing the production and distribution of biofuels, expand feedstock supplies, enhance the trade opportunities for biofuels, support developing countries, support research and innovation. All laudable, but also a rather grand plan. So now, sure, a comprehensive biofuel strategy should and could potentially encompass all of these things. But this ambition to have the best of all possible worlds, to quote Candide, leaves the implementation of the strategy open to all kinds of criticism, of course. And you get what is happening now, which is that the EU has pleased no one. It has not pleased industry. It has not pleased NGOs. It has not pleased member states. It's not pleased regulators. And it's not pleased producers in the developing world. And the net effect is that, in my assessment at least, in the long run, in biofuels will be edged out in the European context by a greater focus on new uses for natural gas in particular, particularly so-called domestic, or what I would say is more accurate, intra-EU unconventional gas, as well as other renewables that certain member states are really pushing. So those being, of course, solar and wind, and of course there's the role of nuclear, is of course a whole other question. But interestingly, a debate that has become less contentious in Europe, the nuclear debate, has become less contentious in Europe as the debate on biofuels has become more contentious. So now the EU Commissioner for Energy, Oettinger, and others will tell you that no, biofuels will always have a major role in our energy and environmental strategies because it is key for the all-important transport sector, which these other areas don't necessarily, which the other energy sources don't necessarily cover. Well, yes, and I would argue that it is. I would argue that that's the case, but not if the general public does not trust the EU sustainable biofuel certification, which was just unveiled, because they think that the biofuel they're using is responsible for releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere by depleting peat bogs, for example, and cutting down forests to sustain agriculture for food production, which you addressed. The same people, it's worth keeping in mind, they're the same people who a decade ago were clamoring against new nuclear power plants in Europe are now linking biofuels with famine. Okay, and as we saw with the development of nuclear in Europe, these views should certainly not be discounted. They are influential, far more influential than the United States and other parts of the world. So my further response, now if Ettinger were here and he were to make the argument I just put to you that it's important for the transport sector, my further response to the EU Energy Commissioner would be that his recent announcement on biofuel sustainability certification in early June, actually I think it was, or mid-June, was the first major statement he has made about the EU's renewable energy strategy, and certainly about biofuels. And there's a reason that the Commissioner has spent his tenure so far looking at so-called strategic energy security issues. What you might call the energy geopolitics of oil and gas, primarily in the European context, natural gas. And that's because EU member states view this, the energy relationship with Russia, with Turkey, with the Caspian region, with Iraq, etc., as more important, frankly, than transforming 10% of the transport fuel sector in the next 10 years, especially if the solution, biofuels, is one that their constituents think is controversial. So, that said, as I mentioned, biofuels has been in the headlines lately in the European context, and this could promote more positive interest. It could, of course, also promote more controversy. And as I mentioned, Ettinger, the EU Energy Commissioner, unveiled in early June the recognized in the EU certification, which is apparently, as it was put in the press conference, the world's most stringent biofuel standards requiring producers to substantially cut CO2 emissions and prove that they don't, as I mentioned, do things like destroy rainforests or drain wetlands, etc. And there was then, after that, a Reuters special report that came out detailing supposedly leaked emails from biofuels lobbyists and EU Commission officials that seemed to point to them trying to collude in mitigating bad press about the effect of biofuel production in developing countries and on global CO2 emissions. Now, I looked at some of those emails, and they didn't look particularly egregious to me, I must say. But the point is that the perception is that biofuels has been revealed to be actually in aggregate bad for the environment, yet the EU still soldiers on with its strategy due to what is interpreted as sort of industry cajoling. Or being too close to the industry, let's put it that way. That's the perception, even though I argue that it's probably not the most accurate perception. But certainly in the past few months has fueled the fire of the controversy in Europe over biofuels. Then the controversy bled over into what became rather loud opposition, and we can talk about this perhaps in more detail in the discussion afterward, from NGOs and commentators on the recently announced EU-Brazil triangular cooperation on biofuels projects in Mozambique and other Portuguese-speaking countries, as well as other parts of the world. Now, the deal and outline makes quite a lot of sense in the context of the EU's biofuel strategy, I think, because while, as you mentioned, biofuels from Brazil are subject to rather high EU tariffs, those produced in Africa with Brazilian companies meet rather low tariffs for the European Union. So it makes sense in that, one of those pillars of the strategy, which was to support developing countries. So the environment, however, or the climate, no pun intended, around biofuels in Europe is not necessarily a friendly one at the moment. So should the new efforts at certifying, that biofuels used in the EU are grown and processed and that their attendant effects on food supplies and the environment are done on a sustainable basis, if those efforts get, in the coming months, good reviews, they may, in fact, interestingly, because much of the certification process is self-regulatory one, is kind of a self-regulatory one from the industry. I should say the regulation is funded by the industry. Then the public mood may begin to change if that certification gets good reviews. So far it has not, but it's only been, a month and a half. That said, I think those who are proponents of biofuels, whether in the industry or not, they should keep in mind, be mindful certainly that the European political context, it will be almost impossible to beat renewables like wind and solar in popularity, and thus in R&D funding from the European Union and member state governments, and in other important areas as well, due merely to the public perception. And also they should keep in mind that without the argument that the transport sector needs a green transformation, biofuels being a sort of bridge fuel to battery-powered hydrogen, etc., and those sorts of ideas, the role for biofuels in the European context would be greatly reduced. So the transport argument is key. And that, of course, is true for biofuels in much of the world, but it is especially true in the European context. Transport is key. Now, for those who are not the biggest fans of biofuels, Europe is probably the best political context in which to gain traction. Because you don't have major agricultural constituents. Now, you do have global agribusiness and energy companies, of course, but not the subsidized, rather small scale in comparison French farmer, who, by the way, whose cow has even more subsidies sent towards it than the Brazilian cow, advocating. You don't have that French farmer who is subsidized for what I would call sort of cultural reasons, advocating for biofuel production. You have him advocating for keeping his way of life that he and his family has had for the last 300 years. And you don't really have an EU member state that is a champion for biofuel production within the EU context either. And so in that sense, there are less obstacles for those who are not such big fans of biofuels in the European context. So those are the two sides of the biofuels coin in the European context, and I welcome the discussion afterwards. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alessandro. Let me clarify that cows in Brazil they have space. They don't have much subsidies supporting them. I would like to invite both Robin and Ford for any comments they may want to make about the three presentations, and I will leave to you to decide who goes first, because I noticed that there is a little problem.
I guess out of habit. All three presentations are very interesting, and there's a lot more in each of them than the speakers could present that I could absorb or that I could respond to. So what I thought I'd try to do is kind of pick up some general themes that I thought appeared in two or maybe in all three presentations. One is sort of what I would call the ready, fire, aim approach to policy development. I think it was clearest in the last case. The European Union has forged its policies without necessarily always having clearly in mind what the ultimate goals, achievable goals, should be. But I thought there was a little bit of that in the Energy Department's comprehensive set of goals, to support science and discovery, to get clean, secure energy, to generate economic prosperity, and to prevent climate change. I mean, that's not a policy agenda. That's kind of a catalog of good values. And I think we need to sharpen the aim of our policies more generally. Second, with the exception of Brazil, most countries pursue a very balkanized approach to biofuels markets, which I think is unfortunate. And I hope to the extent that Brazil has taken on this challenge of trying to globalize an approach to biofuels, that more people will join in support of that effort and ultimately even produce some changes in policies. Third, having been unkind to U.S. energy policy, I would say that the focus coming out of the Department of Energy on research and development and standard setting is appropriate. And those are kinds of activities that help bring down the cost of alternative energy and create environments in which markets can develop and prosper around new answers. The first slide that Joel put up sort of showed a value-added chain that I think it's important for people to pay more attention to. The fuel market for agricultural products has riveted policymakers' attention because of its size, but bioplastics and other applications of carbohydrates are interesting, much higher value, and maybe more achievable and sustainable on an unsubsidized basis over time. This is sort of repeating myself a little bit, but I think one of the big issues that confronts the biofuels industry is this an industry that's going to develop with some kind of a global strategy, or is it going to be built around self-sufficiency appeals in individual countries? And to date, it's been largely around the latter, and it's a very inward-looking kind of a strategy, and I think it's a strategy that over time is going to fail rather than play out successfully. Hopefully we can put biofuels into a much broader global approach to energy security, and so I compliment the Department of Energy in collaborating with China, because that's an important one, but I compliment the Brazilians in their effort to take their message more broadly. And I'll stop there.
Ford.
Well, this panel was very interesting to me because it enlarged the discussion of biofuels in three dimensions, really. The first was an east-west dimension, connection with the bilateral memorandum of understanding with China. The second, in the context of Brazil, was really a larger comment on the north-south relationship in biofuels. And finally, the EU perspective, of course, always raises the kind of difficult questions of accommodating energy and particularly agricultural policies as between the U.S. and the EU, a subject in which Robin and I have toiled for years without any success whatever. But let me comment first on the East-West context. When President Obama was elected, I had great hope and confidence that Steve Chu, given his distinguished credentials and capabilities, would bring some greater rationality to U.S. biofuels policy. And I don't know the inside story, but I suspect that because biofuels policy persists in being dominated by agricultural interests and farm politics rather than sensible national energy policy, he's had less to say than he might have. By contrast, recent reportage in the Times indicates the aggressive role he's played in the Gulf in helping to coordinate the efforts to deal with the BP spill. And if he could play a comparable role in biofuels, I think it would be commendable. I am not a China expert, but I am aware of the fact that China has been very nervous in its own right about the food fuel competition and has canceled many programs that were initially intended to support the expansion of biofuels, precisely because of the expansion of demand for feed grains for livestock that I alluded to earlier. The Brazilian discussion, as always, was fascinating and instructive for U.S. policy. I would identify at least 5 virtues of the Brazilian approach to biofuels that are worthy of emulation, although in some cases impossible for the U.S. to emulate. The first is you actually didn't talk about this very much, Joel, but the integration of the engineering of the vehicular fuel fleet, or vehicular fleet, with the production of biofuels, which has been far advanced over the sort of token efforts at flex fuel vehicles in the United States. Secondly, the aggressive use of indicative land use planning and satellite mapping to rationalize the production of sugarcane in relation to other objectives such as agricultural and sustainability objectives. Third, the explicit understanding of the necessity to capture economies of scale and not to rely on uneconomic low-level or low-scale enterprises. Because I remember having a discussion at FAO a year or so ago with an advocate of small-scale biofuels for development, in which I made the unkind remark that small may be beautiful, but big is profitable. And in the biofuel sector, that's manifestly the case. Third, and this is something the U.S. can't emulate, Robin referred to it as, not a flywheel, but I think of it as a balance wheel. But the capacity of the Brazilian sugar slash ethanol industry to pivot in the production of either one or the other, depending on the relative price relationships, is a particular advantage that doesn't exist to any degree in our corn-based ethanol, or would exist in the cellulosic-based ethanol. There's some obvious substitutability on the maize side, but not like sugar. And finally, the impressive complementarity between the seasonal production of sugar-based ethanol and the availability of hydropower. So this is yet another example of the rationalization of the industry. If I could ask you, Joel, to go back to the slide in which you showed the sort of map of the world and the possibilities for the production of ethanol. This slide is interesting because it suggests at least two things. First of all, Brazil's effort as a sort of pro-sugar-based ethanol development advocate. I once asked a friend from the University of Sao Paulo if Brazil had in mind to become the Saudi Arabia of sugar-based ethanol, and he looked at me as if he was quite shocked at that suggestion. But there is a sense in which Brazil is a kind of emissary in the South for the development of biofuels based on sugar. The other thing this map shows us, or suggests at least, is that if we think about the long-term rationalization of feedstocks for biofuels, assuming that there continues to be a market for biofuels, and I think there will be, simply because of the way the sun strikes the surface of the earth, it's likely that the feedstocks will be lowest cost between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, and that the great middle of the world will be the producer of biomass at lowest cost. By contrast, food crops are favored in the temperate regions of the north, and to a limited extent, the temperate regions of Argentina and Brazil. So I would expect biofuel feedstocks to be produced close to the middle of the surface of the earth, where the sun shines longest and most strongly, and food to be produced in the temperate regions of the world. And there's a sort of a global sense in which that makes that rationalizes the way in which production can occur. Finally, Alexandros' commentary on the EU, I think, captures very well the tensions and difficulties of trying to coordinate policy in Europe. The debate over biofuels, although he didn't use this term there, and perhaps this is a bit unkind, strikes me as rather, but not unusually, self-absorbed. And the fact is that compared to Brazil and the United States, the EU is not a major producer of biofuels, and what it does produce is mainly in the form of biodiesel. So if there's a constituency for their production, it will be in the oilseed sector, because that's the major feedstock for biodiesel. But I do think the European context is useful because the individuals involved in the debate, as you suggest, are generally well informed, if histrionic or perhaps even occasionally hysterical. But this provides a very useful forum for discussing the future of biofuels and also considering the collateral damage or benefits to developing countries, which I think has been a focus of much of the concern related to, for example, the importation of palm oil for biodiesel production in Europe. So all in all, I think that the East-West, North-South, and European perspectives have given quite a bit of depth to our discussion today, and I thank you all for your contributions.
Well, thank you for both of you, Robin and Ford. I would like to open for, well, Joe
It
will.
was sort of a question.
Yes,
I
so,
thought.
and after that, please, we'll have questions, identify ourselves, wait for the microphone, make the questions short.
Ford, as usual, always enjoy your comments and sobering ideas. One, just very briefly, I think there was sort of a question there, so let me just try to point one thing first. On the Saudi Arabia thing, I always love that one because here's the issue. The Saudis sit on oil. Brazil and most of us in the ag side sit on land. The Saudis can only explore their oil until they're out of it, unless they want to sit tight a few million years and wait for whatever is down there to become more oil. We sit on land. What we do with the land and how we do take care of that land matters. If we take all the land and, let's just say, cover it with fill-in-the-blank crop, it will last even less. It will look like Saudi Arabia pretty quickly. But if we use it smartly, it makes a big difference. And that is sort of, where our industry is committed. By the way, that zoning we did is not a very popular thing in Brazil. The other ag groups in Brazil were livid at us for it. But why? Because, we realized that it's better dealing with the problem now, and I'd rather have, the media attacking me for things that aren't true, instead of waiting 30, 40 years from now to when there is a problem. When somebody has decided that, just like we saw and this sort of, as I go towards the second point you made, this issue of the tropics versus the temperate. Yes, the tropics are always going to be great at biomass, and I don't think there's a way that science is going to change that. But let's remember, 20, 30 years ago, everybody said there's absolutely no way Brazil can grow soy. They thought maybe southern Brazil was going to be great at soy, but you couldn't get the Cerrado, the savannas to grow soy. Brazil is now number 1 or 2, depending on how you count, soy producer. Why? Because we managed to change the genetics of the seed and improve soil quality, soil management, and so forth. So the Saudis sit on oil, we sit on land. How we do it really is going to dictate it. And that is really, I think, what is the dilemma of all of this, is if you sit in your ivory tower, and I literally once had a discussion at Harvard where it was sort of this kind of beautiful discussion. I looked out and there was an ivory tower sort of thing. And I said, guys, there's the ivory tower. Let's get out of here. But when you go to the ground and you realize this is more complex and there are choices to be made. And if you really want to make it more complex, mix energy policy with ag policy and trade policy. And that is why it's such a heated debate. I would argue that's why it's such a fun debate. So.
Well, Joel, I think what you say about the distinction between sitting on the land and sitting on subterranean reserves of oil is a very valid one. But actually, my point was a little different. It wasn't so much that I thought that Brazil's intent was to cartelize sugar-based ethanol. Sure. Rather, it had to do with the potential and positive role that Brazil can play in the development objectives of other countries in the South through a kind of resource diplomacy. I noted, Alexandros, that you worked for a while at the Institute for Strategic Studies. In the 1970s, I studied with Alistair Buchan, who founded that institute. And the work that we did together before he died had to do with the relationship between the nascent OPEC cartel and what was frequently referred to at that time as the food weapon. So the interplay between agricultural policy and energy policy at the level of diplomacy is really what I had in mind. Sure. And I think that that's coming to the fore now in ways that haven't been true since the 1970s.
Yep.
and will define a lot of the interests of people concerned with international affairs and international trade as we go forward and as we have discussions in places like this one. So that's what I had in mind.
But a 10-second sort of point on that. Agreed, understood. See your difference. The issue here is when it comes to sugarcane, there is a cartel. It's called the developed world because now we've managed to get the European sugar policy to change. But rest assured, we're allowed to sell 150,000 tons of sugar to the U.S. under the U.S. quota. Okay? We export 20 million metric tons of sugar. Why is that? So when we go to ethanol, rest assured, we got into ethanol because we had a food problem. It's the food versus fuel debate flipped on its head. We couldn't sell the food anywhere else, so we had to go find other uses for it. That's the irony of it. And so Saudi Arabia could form a cartel. We live in a cartel. It's called the "you can't sell sugar here" cartel.
Well, just one point for an illustration, I think useful about the geopolitics of this. A few years back, 4 years back, I think, President Lula went to Nicaragua and was asked by Daniel Ortega to help him develop ethanol industry there, to produce electricity, because Nicaragua is completely dependent on oil, on fossil fuels to produce electricity, and you may guess who is the main supplier. And Daniel Ortega was uncomfortable with that situation and asking President Lula. I don't know what happened since then, but this is one of those very positives, potential connections that you can make out of this type of technology and model developed in Brazil. Now, questions, please. Yes, sir.
And while they're coming, Nicaragua makes more money selling sugar to the U.S. than they ever will make in their oil bill.
Thank you. I'm Don Crane from the International Fertilizer Development Center. My question is for Joel, as someone who's looked at alternative feedstocks and also to some extent the energy issues in Africa. What do you think of the production of ethanol from cassava in landlocked countries of Africa?
I'll make a generic point on all the sort of other feedstocks, and I kind of refer back to sort of, it's the performance stupid question. People love to talk about, switchgrass. I actually went back and had to figure out how do you say switchgrass in Portuguese, which, by the way, if I say it, you'll think it's a real bad cuss word. It really sounds horrible when you think about it in English. But the issue is, we've tried switchgrass. The University of São Paulo looked at switchgrass. The yields are horrible, at least in Brazil. And the idea of trying to get that yield up was forget about it. So my question is always, can you get the yields up, and can you make then the point of scale? It's one thing for me to, we can all make moonshine in our backyard. Trust me, the technology is not that complicated. But you got to get it in scale so that you can at some point be competitive. And at some point, you can turn around to the guy selling fossil fuels and says, I can beat you. And so whatever, I wouldn't have the answer on cassava in a certain place, but if you can get, from an ag side, you can make an argument to say this is a better use for this plot of land, and that you can actually find a market and so forth. There's a lot of places in the world where that's probably not going to be the case. There are others there. I think actually Brazil's looking at some cassava, and there are issues for that. And but I come back to the principles. Can you get that performance on the feedstock? Can you get that market viability and so forth?
Embrapa, the Brazilian Agricultural Research Company, is actually working with African countries and looking at precisely that question on cassava. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Kep Davis again from the Department of Energy. My question is about fertilizer. Phosphorus, easy phosphorus, they say, is about gone. In other words, peak production of phosphorus, which is one of the three main nutrients you need to grow anything. And so it's going to be more difficult to find phosphorus in the future. the population of the world is going from 6.5 billion to 9 billion in the next 30, 40 years. Demand for food, we already mentioned here, because of demand for meat, and also developing world developing is going to skyrocket a lot faster than population growth. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on land, which you're sitting on, and water resources, and possibly constrained by things like land and water, and also phosphorus or the other fertilizer ingredients. So almost all of the talk today has been about biofuels that are grown on the same land that you would use for food. And so my question has to do with how do we get around these constraints? And just to seed that a little bit, is anybody anywhere talking about using halophytes, salt-loving plants on arid land, using salt water, wastewater, those types of things, in order to free up land for food production so that we can continue some sort of a biofuels? And yeah, there's probably plenty of land in the near term for biofuels. Perhaps in Brazil, you have lots of unused land, even with the zoning. But if we want biofuels to supplant fossil fuels completely, then the answer is there's not enough earths for that unless you go to something like arid land and perhaps thinking about using resources like salt water for some of the nutrients and the water.
You know who's actually looking at that is the United Arab Emirates have a project, the Masdar project. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but they're starting to look at exactly that, the halophytes, and DOE may be doing some technical assistance with that, but that's a very interesting point. Yeah, I agree. Algae, I think, is your best bet as far as not having to use phosphorus for a fertilizer, and that's definitely being explored. I mean, I don't know if you saw Solazyme just sold a lot of jet fuel to the Navy.
Diesel, actually.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, but you know, and they're using algae as their feedstock, so it's definitely one direction that.
But even algae needs a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus.
Yeah, actually, those Solazyme's technology is actually, it's not the algae you and I think about. It's the algae that actually grows in caves, doesn't need light, and it's actually consuming raw sugar in that case. And so it's fascinating. But I think the point here, and what I would add to that is, you know, we will do this and the next generations a huge disservice if we decide, you know, we're going to pick one technology, one feedstock, one place to do it. You know, the reality is we're going to have this is sort of an all hands on deck. And yes, we want to make sure that we're making the more sensible choices there. But also let's be careful not to say, you know, okay, here's what Congress loves to do. Cellulosic ethanol from switchgrass, a certain president decided was a great idea. It may well be in a certain place at a certain time. And the truth of the matter is it probably will complement others. And I think that's really, you know, if UAE can do this, it'd be great, you know, if it's sustainable and so forth. Not sure it makes sense to go, you know, do that in the middle of Sao Paulo where you have almost more rain than sometimes you want to.
Yes, please.
Hi, Chris Dragasak from Conservation International. For those who don't know us, we do a lot of work on biofuels related to land use, and within that, ecosystem services, food production, livelihoods, et cetera. I was selfishly very interested that the discussion came around to trade, in part because we're preparing a side event for the CBD related to sustainability criteria and trade issues. So I wanted to take advantage of the collective brainpower to ask of the panelists and of the people sitting in the room. We've talked a lot about the fact that biofuels is a new market, is a voluntary market, is a decision-based market as opposed to food production. We've talked about the fact that there's a need for harmonization of policies, the real need and the recognized need for sustainability within the industry, and the need for a level playing field for producers and for importers globally. there's a real opportunity for leadership within the industry on these issues, and I think policies related to sustainability are key to that. Yet there's a lot of opposition from certain countries to those policies, in part because they're seen as non-tariff trade barriers. So I'm interested in, for China, for Brazil, for the EU, for the US, what the view of sustainability criteria are in terms of trade, and then individually what you think it should be.
Who goes first?
Chris, thanks. You and I have shared a lot of stages and things, so I'm going to try to be very brief because I think you probably know this. This is our Star Wars slide. These are all the sustainability criteria related things that UNICA, just one trade association, is involved on. I don't think our competitors are that involved in that one, but nevertheless, it just shows you there's certainly enough talk and enough discussion on it. And as I pointed out, we're committed to it. Here's my fear when it comes to trade. And I've tried to play with this phrase a little bit, but see if you get it. I'm afraid in some places, maybe across the Atlantic, that sustainability, we're working on the sustainability of protectionism. That we have decided that there's a new way, non-tariff barrier we can create. It's called, let's throw the sustainability card. And the danger with that is, A, we set the bar so high that nobody can meet, and then we're still stuck on old unsustainable fuels like fossil fuels. Or that we decide to go down the road of, let's go have more litigation at the World Trade Organization over this because, it's one thing to apply a standard to everybody. It's a whole other thing that says, well, but domestic industry doesn't have to meet that because we've got very robust laws here that prohibit that. So the sustainability of protectionism, I think, is alive and well in the biofuels community. There's obviously reasons that industries need a little protection to grow sometimes. In the case of the U.S., we think 32 years is probably enough. It certainly has worked. And my biggest fear is that we are either throwing the baby out with the bathwater in the general discussion, or in this case, sometimes asking so much of it that we're ensuring that nothing ever happens.
Well, just a very quick comment. I don't think I could have put it better for the European context than sustainability of protectionism. I think that's a very good. I'm going to use that from now on.
And we'll put it on Wikipedia, then everybody can have it, right?
Right. I can update it with a lot of examples on Wikipedia as well. But I think what we should also keep in mind that especially for the impact it has on biofuels, evolves as well. So in the European context, for example, it's not just protectionism for agriculture. It's also increasingly in the future, when you're talking about energy strategy EU-wide, protectionism, for example, so-called domestic sources of natural gas, and other industries, for example. Advocates for wind in the north of Europe and advocates for solar power in the south of Europe. That's, frankly, protectionism of another sort. But in the European context, sustaining that protectionism, I would say, is certainly the member states' priority. And the European Union is, as I mentioned again, is kind of stuck in the middle, regardless of what it would like to see. The reality is sometimes very different.
And I wanted to go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, the question is actually probably one of the most thorny and difficult raised today, despite the fact that lots of other thorny and difficult issues present themselves in biofuels. And because essentially what it does is it raises the whole question of the interface between trade and environment, subject on which I've worked a lot. But one slight amendation. I'd suggest rather than the protectionism of sustainability, or the sustainability of protectionism, this is really about the use of sustainability as protectionism.
Right. Well, that's what I mean.
I think what you meant. And whilst that is certainly a deep concern of the trade community, the environmental community, I think, has reason to worry about whether or not patterns of trade are not themselves injurious to the environment and how to protect against that. I think putting on the hat of a former special assistant to the U.S. Trade Representative, my own view is that the most difficult trade environment interaction that probably presents itself in the context of biofuels will be the famous and difficult problem of product-process distinctions. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but if you have studied the arcana of GATT law, you'll know that that is a very difficult one, and that in general the tradition of decision-making in the now World Trade Organization has emphasized that whilst it's valid to take action against products, if one attempts to plumb below the product to object to the process by which that product is made, that has not been consistent with the interpretation of the GATT articles. And in order to really get at the biofuels issue and impacts of biofuels on land use, et cetera, you're definitely talking about the process and the feedstocks and so on. So I would just say that, you know, that's probably where the most difficult issues are going to present themselves.
And were it that clear? Because some processes are now being validated by the GATT WTO process. So I wanted to take the sustainability issue a little different direction. I mean, I think you've got sort of sustainability as a general interest of the world and seeing it embedded in markets privately. Second, you've got sustainability that is an issue that arises because governments begin to distort markets and their actions change the signals. And carbon tax in the United States, you know, are we going to offset at the border? Sustainability criteria to make sure that the subsidies going into biofuels in Indonesia are producing the kind of biofuels we want, I think is an entirely different kind of question. Once the government is beginning to alter the prices, I think, unfortunately, it's legitimate to ask under the trading system whether there should be some sort of offsets to those distortions. But last, given the organization that you represent, I think that it would be interesting if more people would look at the sustainability issue separate from the energy issue. I mean, if we are talking about greenhouse gas reductions and replacing current fuels, why do we have to find solutions that do both at the same time? Traditionally, we've learned that the policies are most cost-effective that have a single objective and aim at that. And I'll give an example. We know that grasses are very effective at sequestering carbon. We believe that gases are relatively inefficient as a source of energy. Why couldn't we separate those two questions and say, you know, if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, promoting grass production in marginal areas would be a useful strategy, but trying to harvest it as fuel would be a bad strategy. I mean, we ought to be pulling some of these questions apart rather than pretending that there is going to be a single solution to these multiple objectives.
Questions? Well, so I think it's a rare occasion where we end 15 minutes early. Never happened to me. That's Ken's magic. Thank you very much for enlightening this discussion. Robin, Ford, Alexandrus, Carl, Joe, on behalf of my colleague Kent Hughes of the Program on America and the Global Economy, the Brazil Institute, on the Global Energy Initiative. Thank you. The video of this presentation will be available soon on the net. I would like to thank not only our audience here that helped us with very good questions, also those who followed this proceeding, this discussion from a distance, and stay tuned. Keep checking our websites. We are going probably to slow down a little bit now in August, but come September we will be back. And in the case of the Brazil Institute, I'd like to mark on your calendars, please, two important days. The 22nd of September, we are going to have one more discussion here on innovation policies related to legal frameworks in Brazil, with including a very important member of the Brazilian Supreme Court that will be debating that. On the 23rd, we will have friends from the Pew Center for the People and the Press and from Prospectiva International, a consulting firm in Brazil, helping us to do a presentation before the first round of the October 3rd presidential elections, when we are going to predict everything in detail. Really not. Thank you very much.
Can I give you one more date?
Yeah, Joe.
December 31st. That is the last day of the year, and by that point, Congress has to decide whether they're going to keep subsidizing domestic corn ethanol to the tune of $6 billion a year and reduce the tariff on imported ethanol.
And we'll have a seminar on that. Thank you.